A woman in designer clothes shrieked in horror as 2 tons of fresh manure cascaded down on her pristine white RAV4. That's exactly what happened when the HOA president trespassed on my third-generation family farm and started ripping up my crops. After decades of honest work, I wasn't about to let some city folks with fancy titles take what was rightfully mine, but would my manure revenge end up costing me everything I've worked for? My name's Frank Miller, 45 years old and proud owner of Sunset Valley Farm. This 80-acre piece of heaven has sustained my family for 2 generations. My grandfather bought this land with cash in 1957. My father expanded it during the boom years, and I've kept it going through thick and thin since taking over in 2005. Every furrow, fence post, and barn board here has a story behind it, stories these newcomers couldn't possibly understand. Everything changed 2 years ago when Lakeview Estates broke ground right across from my northern fields. No actual lake in sight. Mind you, just a pretentious name for 48 cookie-cutter houses starting at $450,000 each. The development company promised a harmonious integration with the surrounding countryside. What that really meant was they expected me to change how I'd been farming for 15 years to suit their suburban sensibilities. Margaret Whitfield moved in 3 months after they started selling homes. Mid-50s, just a bit older than me, drove a brand-new white RAV4, and within a month had maneuvered herself into becoming president of their homeowners association. The woman had a talent for organizing complaints, especially about my farm. First, it was the roosters crowing too early. Then the offensive odors when I fertilized my fields. Then the dust from my combine during harvest season damages their air quality. I tried being neighborly at first, invited them to a community barbecue, offered fresh produce, even adjusted my schedule to spread manure when the wind was blowing away from their houses. Some neighbors were friendly and appreciative, but Margaret made it clear she considered my farm an eyesore that was lowering their property values. "This is the 21st century, Mr. Miller," she told me once over my fence line. "People want clean air and picturesque views, not agricultural eyesores and animal waste. Perhaps it's time to consider retirement? Our development company is very interested in acquiring properties like yours." Last month, they held a community meeting I wasn't invited to. My friend Bill, who moved into Lakeview against my warnings, called me afterward. "Frank, they're organizing against you," he said. "Margaret's put together a committee to document violations on your property. They're talking about getting the county to condemn parts of your land through some environmental regulation." What Bill didn't tell me until later was that Margaret specifically mentioned finding the right violations that could force county intervention. "We just need proper documentation," she'd said. "Every old farm has dozens of code violations. We just need to find the right ones. I've weathered droughts, floods, market crashes, and bank threats, but having people plot to take away my livelihood because it didn't fit their suburban vision, that cut deeper than anything. Last Wednesday was fertilizing day. I was spreading manure on my north fields, the ones facing Lakeview Estates. Nothing unusual about it, just regular farm maintenance I've done for decades. I'd been extra careful to check the wind direction and start early before the day heated up, minimizing any odor that might drift their way. Around noon, I noticed a white RAV4 parked right on the edge of my newly planted cornfield. Not on the access road. Mind you, actually on my tilled soil, crushing young seedlings under its tires. The driver's side door was open, and I could see Margaret walking through my crop rows, taking pictures with her phone. I drove my tractor over, trying to keep my temper in check. This wasn't the first time she'd come onto my property uninvited, but it was the first time she'd been brazen enough to drive onto my planted fields. "Margaret, you're on private property," I called out, "and your car is damaging my crops." She barely looked up from her phone. "Documenting the decrease in air quality and environmental hazards your operation is causing," she said, snapping more photos. "The HOA board is building a case to present to the county commissioners next week." "This is trespassing," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're welcome to take all the pictures you want from the road, but you need to move your car and get off my field now." She waved me off like I was some kind of servant. "I'll only be another few minutes. The commissioners need to see exactly what's happening here. This land should be put to better use anyway." We're planning to propose rezoning at next month's county meeting. She tapped something on her phone screen. Besides, our environmental consultant needs soil samples. You should consider our buyout offer before property values force you out. As she said this, I watched in disbelief as she bent down, deliberately pulled up several of my corn seedlings by the roots, and placed them in small plastic bags she had in her pocket. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "Those are my crops." "Evidence," she replied coolly. "Our consultant needs to test for pesticide contamination and runoff. If the levels are what we suspect, the county will have to take action." I asked her firmly to leave immediately. She just rolled her eyes and said she'd leave when she had enough evidence. As she turned away, I noticed something moving in the sky above us, Ryan Thompson's drone. Ryan was my neighbor Tom's 17-year-old son, always flying that thing around the countryside, making videos. Today, it was hovering about 100 feet up, its camera probably capturing our entire interaction. That's when something in me just snapped. I drove my tractor back to the barn, my hands shaking on the wheel. Who did this woman think she was? I'd paid taxes on this land for 20 years, followed every agricultural regulation to the letter, and now someone who'd lived here less than 2 years was pulling up my crops and threatening my livelihood? My front-end loader was half full, with fresh manure from mucking out the barn that morning. I stared at it for a good minute, the rich, pungent smell filling my nostrils. I knew what I was thinking wasn't right. My father had always taught me to handle disagreements with neighbors respectfully. "You have to live next to these people," he'd say. "Never burn a bridge you might need to cross later." But this was different. This wasn't a disagreement about a fence line or a wandering cow. This was someone actively trying to take my land, my heritage, through manipulative, underhanded means. I noticed Ryan had landed his drone on the edge of my equipment shed. I waved him over. "Caught some of that on camera, did you?" I asked. He nodded, looking a bit nervous. "Yes, sir, Mr. Miller. I was just testing out the new tracking feature and saw you two talking. Did I do something wrong?" "Not at all," I assured him. "But I'd appreciate it if you'd keep that drone in the air for a bit longer. You might want to record what happens in my north field in the next hour." He looked confused, but nodded. "Sure thing. Battery's almost full anyway." I called my lawyer first, old Jim Roberts, who's handled my affairs for 30 years. "Jim, hypothetically speaking, if someone parks on my property without permission and is damaging my crops, what are my rights?" "You can have them towed at their expense," he said, "though usually a warning is the first step." "And what if I accidentally dump manure on their car while doing my normal farm work?" The long silence told me all I needed to know. "Frank," he finally said, "whatever you're thinking, don't do it. Call the sheriff instead." I thanked him and hung up. Called the sheriff's office and was told a deputy could come out in 2 to 3 hours due to a pile-up on the highway. Margaret would be long gone by then, with her evidence against me. I went to the feed room and grabbed an old pair of work gloves. I'd spent my life following rules, being a good neighbor, turning the other cheek. Where had it gotten me? A woman was on my property, destroying my crops, and plotting to take my land. Sometimes a man has to take a stand, even a messy one. I backed the tractor up to our manure pile and filled the front-end loader to capacity, probably close to 2 tons of fresh, steaming cow manure. The smell was powerful, even for someone used to it like me. I smiled thinking about how it would smell to someone who complained about farm odors from half a mile away. As I drove toward the field, I could see Ryan's drone hovering high above, its camera capturing everything. In the distance, Margaret was still wandering through my crops, now toward the back of her RAV4, where she'd apparently opened a hatch. She was loading something into the back, more of my plants, most likely. What caught my attention was that she'd actually moved her car further into my field, closer to where I'd been working earlier. The white vehicle was now sitting right in the middle of my newly planted corn section, crushing even more seedlings beneath its tires. This wasn't just trespassing anymore, it was deliberate destruction of my livelihood. I stopped the tractor about 50 feet away and called out one last warning. "Margaret, this is your final notice. You're trespassing on private property and damaging my crops. Move your vehicle and leave now." She turned, saw me sitting in the loader, and actually had the nerve to laugh. "Or what? You'll call the police? I'm on the phone with Commissioner Davis right now." We're discussing the impact of your outdated farming practices on our community's air quality. I inched the tractor forward. I'm giving you 30 seconds to move your vehicle. This is exactly the kind of threatening behavior we're documenting, she said, holding up her phone like a shield. The commissioner will hear about this too. Maybe we'll add intimidation to the complaint. She kept filming, probably thinking I was bluffing. I wasn't. I could hear my father's voice in my head telling me to be better than this, to handle things the right way. But then I remembered how developers had pressured him just before he handed the farm to me, how the stress had affected his health. I wasn't going to let history repeat itself. When I got her car, I raised a bucket high above the roof of her pristine white RAV4. Margaret's expression finally changed from smug to concerned. "You wouldn't dare," she said, backing up a step, her phone still recording. I held her gaze for a long moment. This is for my father and his father before him. I pulled the hydraulic lever, and 2 tons of fresh manure cascaded down, covering her car from roof to wheels. The slope splattered and oozed down the windows, into the open driver's side door and hatchback, across the leather seats and carpeted cargo area. The stench was immediate and overwhelming in the midday heat. Margaret's scream could have been heard all the way to the county line. In that moment, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years, the visceral justice of watching an entitled bully face immediate consequences. "My CAR," she shrieked, dropping her phone into the muck. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I sat calmly in my tractor. "Just spreading fertilizer on my field, ma'am, like I've done for 15 years. Not my fault you parked where I was working after seeing me out here with a manure spreader." She tried to reach in her car to grab her purse, but recoiled at the mess inside. Her designer outfit was now splattered with brown streaks, and when she tried to wipe manure off her phone, she only ground it deeper into the screen. You, she sputtered, seeming unable to find words vile enough. "This is assault, destruction of property. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you own." I nodded toward her car. "You might want to consider how a judge will view your trespassing and destruction of crops. This is still private property, and you were warned repeatedly to leave." She stormed off toward my farmhouse, leaving a trail of manure footprints behind her. "I'm using your phone to call the police, and then you're paying for a new car." I glanced up to see Ryan's drone still hovering overhead, capturing everything. The kid gave me a thumbs up from where he stood by the equipment shed. That footage might come in handy later. As Margaret marched away, my neighbor Tom pulled up in his pickup. He'd been driving by and couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Frank," he said, looking from the manure-covered RAV4 to Margaret's retreating figure, "tell me you didn't just do what I think you did." When I explained what had happened, the trespassing, the crop damage, the threats, he burst out laughing. "About time someone stood up to that bunch," he said. "They've been making everyone's lives miserable since they moved in." Did she really think she could just drive onto your crops? Apparently so, I said, realizing the magnitude of what I'd done was starting to sink in. "Think I've gone too far?" Tom looked thoughtful. "Maybe, but sometimes too far is exactly far enough to make a point." Within an hour, my quiet farm had become the center of a small circus. Margaret had called not just the sheriff, but the police chief, the county commissioner, her lawyer, and apparently everyone in her contact list. 2 patrol cars, Margaret's husband's Mercedes, and several other vehicles from Lakeview Estates were parked along my fence line. Deputies were taking statements while Margaret, now in clean clothes someone had brought her, was dramatically describing how I'd assaulted her and her property with biological waste. Her husband, a tall, thin man I'd only seen once before at a distance, was photographing the manure-covered RAV4 from every angle, looking like he might be sick from the smell. A small crowd of Lakeview residents had gathered, some looking horrified, others seeming to hide smiles behind their hands. Sheriff Anderson, who I've known since he played high school football with my dad 20 years ago, was trying not to smile as he approached me. "Frank, what were you thinking?" he asked, shaking his head but with a twinkle in his eye. I shrugged. "She parked on my property without permission while I was fertilizing. Just bad timing on her part." He sighed. "She's pressing charges for criminal damage to property. Says her car is worth over $40,000 with all the options." And what about her trespassing? Damaging my crops? Harassment? I've reported problems with these HOA folks 3 times in the past year. The sheriff nodded. I know. And technically, you do have the right to remove trespassers and vehicles from your property. He lowered his voice. Between us, I think you made your point. But this is going to get messy, and I don't just mean the car. As he walked away, Margaret approached her lawyer, a slick-looking fellow in an expensive suit who seemed uncomfortable standing in cow pasture with his polished shoes. He held a handkerchief over his nose despite being a good 20 feet from the car. Mr. Miller, the lawyer began with practiced condescension, my client is prepared to file both criminal and civil actions against you for this outrageous act of vandalism and assault. However, we might be willing to settle this matter privately if you're prepared to make a suitable offer for her damages, and perhaps reconsider the HOA's generous purchase offer for your property. So that was their game. Use this incident to pressure me into selling. I looked him straight in the eye. My lawyer will be in touch. In the meantime, I'll be filing trespassing charges and crop damage claims against Mrs. Whitfield. The lawyer smirked. Good luck with that. It's your word against hers about any permission to be on the property. I smiled back. We'll see about that. What neither of them knew was that Ryan had already sent me the drone footage, which clearly showed Margaret pulling up my crops and moving her car deliberately into my work area. As the crowd began to disperse, I noticed something unexpected. Several cars driving by on the county road were honking in support. One pickup truck even slowed down, the driver giving me a thumbs up before continuing on. Word was spreading fast in our rural community, and the first verdict was already coming in. I expected most people to think I'd gone too far. What surprised me was how many stood behind me. By the next morning, Manure Justice had become a local sensation. The diner in town added a Farmer Frank special to their menu, a big pile of hash browns with brown gravy covering everything. The barista at the coffee shop winked and told me my latte was on the house for the local hero. Bobby Miller from the feed store called to say he'd started a legal defense fund that had already raised $5,000 in donations. People are tired of city folks moving in and trying to change our way of life, he said. You're just the first one with the guts to push back. Turns out I wasn't the only one fed up with Lakeview Estates HOA. Local farmers brought pies and casseroles to show support. Old-timers who'd seen their way of life gradually squeezed out by development stopped by to shake my hand. 3 different people offered to help clean up the manure, not from Margaret's car, but from my field where it had spilled. Someone even made T-shirts with a silhouette of a tractor and the words, "Mess with the farm, get the fertilizer." I spotted 4 people wearing them at the hardware store the next day. But not everyone was amused. The county paper ran an editorial about respect for property and civil discourse. The Lakeview Estates board sent a formal complaint to every government office they could think of. Margaret gave tearful interviews about being traumatized and fearing for her safety. Then came the cease and desist letter from her lawyer demanding $75,000 for the car, cleaning costs, emotional distress, and lost wages while she couldn't drive to work. When I showed it to my lawyer, Jim, he whistled through his teeth. They're playing hardball, Frank. But so can we. The pressure was mounting, but so was my resolve. When 3 other farmers canceled their HOA architectural review applications in solidarity with me, I knew this had become bigger than just my fight. It was about drawing a line in the soil. A week after the incident, I was sitting in my lawyer's office reviewing the mounting legal documents. Things weren't looking good. The district attorney was considering criminal charges for destruction of property, and Margaret's civil suit was moving forward with claims now exceeding $100,000. They've got photographic evidence of your tractor dumping manure on her car, Jim said, and a dozen witnesses. What about trespassing? The crop damage? She was pulling up my plants and putting them in bags. Her lawyer claims she had implied permission to be there since you'd never posted no trespassing signs facing their development specifically. It's weak, but they're playing hardball. Just as we were discussing settlement options, my phone rang. It was Ryan. Mr. Miller, I edited that drone footage from last week. There's something important you need to see. An hour later, Ryan, Tom, my lawyer, and I were watching the footage on the big screen TV in my living room. The drone had captured everything, including parts one hadn't seen. From the aerial view, you could clearly see Margaret not just taking pictures, but methodically pulling up my corn seedlings and placing them in sample bags. The footage captured her making a phone call where she clearly said, "I've got enough evidence now. If we report enough violations, we can get the county to condemn this eyesore." Most damning of all, it showed her moving her car after seeing me fertilizing, deliberately parking it closer to where I was working, apparently to document the smell and activity up close. "Can you get audio from this height?" I asked Ryan, amazed at the clarity. "Not usually," he admitted, but she was on speakerphone and the drone was directly overhead during that call. The new microphones are pretty sensitive. My lawyer sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This changes everything. She deliberately trespassed, damaged crops, and positioned her vehicle in your work area after seeing what you were doing. We can argue she assumed the risk." Ryan, looking proud of his footage, added, "I've got more. I've been documenting those HOA people trespassing on local farms for my senior project on agricultural rights in changing communities. Mrs. Whitfield has been on your property at least 3 other times in the past month." The drone footage was our ace in the hole, the unexpected twist that would turn the tables. The sheriff couldn't hide his grin when we showed him the footage. "I always had a feeling there was more to this story. I'm showing this to the DA. The charges against you will likely be dropped." But we didn't stop there. My lawyer sent the footage to Margaret's attorney with a counteroffer. "Drop all claims against me. Pay for my damaged crops, or we'd file criminal charges for trespass, vandalism, filing a false police report, and attempted fraud." The response was immediate. Within hours, her lawyer requested a meeting to discuss an amicable resolution. Then came the call I never expected. Commissioner Davis himself phoned me. "Frank, I've known your family since your father's time. Margaret told me you were creating environmental hazards, but this video shows she was manufacturing evidence. The commission values our agricultural heritage and won't be party to this kind of manipulation." He cleared his throat. Off the record, my brother-in-law said it's the funniest thing he's seen in 20 years of selling cars. Said he'd detail her RAV4 for free just to tell the story. Ryan's senior project suddenly became much bigger than a school assignment. A state agricultural preservation group asked permission to use the footage in their advocacy work. Then a regional news station picked up the story. The next day's local paper ran a front-page story. "Drone footage reveals HOA president's plot against local farm." The online video went viral, with over 200,000 views in 48 hours. Comments poured in from farmers across the country, sharing similar stories of development, encroaching on agricultural land. Letters to the editor flooded in, most supporting me. "Farmers have rights too," wrote one local business owner. "These developments need to respect the agricultural community they chose to move next to." I'd accidentally become the unlikely hero in a David versus Goliath story. Except in this version, David had a manure spreader instead of slingshot. The most satisfying moment came when Margaret's insurance company denied her claim, citing intentional acts and assumption of risk by the policyholder. After reviewing the drone footage, they determined she had deliberately parked in an active work area after observing the ongoing fertilization. 3 Lakeview Estates board members privately contacted me to distance themselves from Margaret's actions. "Many of us moved here because we appreciate the rural character," one told me. "We don't all share her views about your farm." 2 weeks later, all charges against me were dropped. Margaret was charged with trespassing, vandalism, and filing a false police report. Her civil lawsuit collapsed when her own insurance company's denial became part of the public record. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and replaced Margaret as president. Their new leadership proposed a community farmers market on weekends to bridge the gap between old and new neighbors and offered to sponsor agricultural education days for residents to better understand farming practices. At the next county meeting, Commissioner Davis introduced a new Agricultural Heritage Protection Act that would prevent rezoning of historic farmland without extensive review and owner consent. It passed unanimously to applause from the packed chamber. Ryan's drone footage earned him a scholarship to film school from an agricultural advocacy group. He told me he wanted to make a documentary about the changing rural landscape in America. I told him he had plenty of material right here. The incident sparked a wider conversation in our county about development, farming rights, and how communities change. 3 other farmers who had been considering selling to developers decided to stay, inspired by the outpouring of community support. As for Margaret, she and her husband quietly put their house up for sale the following month. I heard they moved to a condo in the city where, as my neighbor Tom put it, the only manure she'll have to deal with is what comes out of politicians' mouths. Last week, a new family moved in, a young couple with 3 kids who bought Margaret's old house at a significant discount. Apparently, the manure incident had affected property values after all, just not in the way she predicted. Yesterday, they came over with a homemade pie and asked if their children could learn about farming. The oldest boy, about 10, looked up at me with big eyes. "Is it true you buried a car in poop?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Not exactly, son, but I did teach someone an important lesson about respecting other people's property." His father winked at me, "And we made sure to park on the road, not in your fields." The boy thought for a moment. "My teacher says manure helps things grow. Did it help anything grow at your farm?" I smiled. As a matter of fact, it did. It helped grow understanding between neighbors. Sometimes that's the most important crop of all. Some lessons stick better when they come with a powerful smell. Standing up for what's right isn't always clean or polite. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty, or in my case, cover someone's car in manure. At 45 years old, I've learned that good fences make good neighbors, but sometimes what you really need is 2 tons of fertilizer and the courage to use it. This farm will stay a farm as long as I'm alive to work it. And anyone who doesn't like it, well, my cows are always making more fertilizer.